Hello, my name is Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on human sexual attraction, and it's just going to be an exposition on really the concept of human sexual attraction from the standpoint of what we know in terms of psychology and neuroscience at this point in time in terms of the relevant literature I've seen up to this point. So with that said, the first thing I'd like to talk about, I suppose, are some. I think I'll start with some myths. So, there are a few myths that have to pertain. Excuse me, I just ate. To some of the things you read about human sexuality online. One thing I was reading was that there is a new app that will be coming out, dating app that will be coming out, I believe, in either next year or in the next 2 years. I can't really remember the specific name. I think it was something like Pheromore or something like that. But the reason why this was mentioned in this article is because what's relevant about Pheromore and this in the pheromone studies, which I don't know how familiar people are with the pheromone studies, but I'll talk about the pheromone studies and then talk about what's problem with this, because it's something that actually exists in the psychology of many people when they think of the biological dynamics of human sexuality. In 1976, there was some research done, I believe, in somewhere in the Eastern Bloc in Europe, at the very least. What was done in this study was the sexual selectiveness of mice was measured, and what the researchers wanted to know was what criteria do mice use to select their sexual partners. And so what they noticed is that whenever they compared the DNA of the paired mice, that the histone compatibility complex differed. So there is variation across each of the partners' patterns. They did not have very similar histone complexes. And so what that led the researchers to think is that, and so when they were asking, first, before I say that, when they were asking the question of how do the mice know this about one another, they discovered that mice do emit various scents and fragrances called pheromones, and it's through these pheromones that they pick up the quality of the histone compatibility of their mate, in terms of its variance from theirs. And so that's how they go about selecting mates. So what this led researchers to speculate was that, so this was true about mice, okay? That's the first thing I'd say. And what that led other researchers to speculate was perhaps maybe the same thing is true about human beings. And so there was a study done, I think in the 80s, actually maybe in the 90s, well, 19 in the 90s, study done, the sweaty t-shirt study. And what goes on in the sweaty t-shirt study is basically, I think this was done in Sweden. They get a group of women who are ovulating, so that's the time they're in their ovulation aspect of their menstrual cycle, to sift through a pile of sweaty t-shirts given to them by men, and to pick and rate what t-shirts they like the best. And the researchers did this because they thought that perhaps with human sexual selection, that this same pheromone phenomenon would be true. And so the women smelled these t-shirts, and then they ranked them, and sure enough, whenever the scientists looked at who they ranked and they tested the blood testosterone level of these men, they found that the women tended to prefer the men with higher blood testosterone levels. Now, I'm going to pause the tape here figuratively and say, first, let's think about what some potential problems could be with this study. One of the things that you will notice is that the first study was done with mice. And another thing you can notice about mice is that in terms of their neuroperceptual makeup, they're olfactory based, meaning that they use their nose first to make sense of what's going on in the world. Mice use their nose for just about everything. And so it makes sense that for mice, they would know the quality of a mate based off of what they smelled, rather than some other sense per se. And I'm sure mice use other sense to evaluate one another and things like that, but that just seems to be the dominant sense they use to select for their mates, which to me makes all the sense in the world because from a neural logical perceptual level, mice see the world through their nose. That doesn't mean that they don't have other senses that are meaningful. For example, human beings have multiple senses, but we're visual creatures fundamentally. And the same is true for most animals. There's some perceptive capacity that exists as the dominant function in their neuroperceptual scheme because for some reason nature prefers specialization over multitudinal generalization. That's just a little evolutionary biology fact to throw in there for you. But with that said, that makes sense for mice. Now let's think about human beings. And I just said something previously that should kind of set off some alarms in your mind. Human beings, could the same thing be true for us? Because if you look at us from a neuroperceptual standpoint, you notice that we are not olfactory based creatures, but we're visual creatures. Next, the thing about blood testosterone levels in men is that they actually spike throughout the day. And so if you grab, so there's a historical component to blood testosterone levels or a temporal component of blood testosterone levels. Also, you can influence your blood testosterone levels by how much sleep you had the previous night, what your nutrition's like, how often you go to the gym, what's your current level of health, what's your job status, how much you make per year. All of the various factors that can influence how much trait testosterone level is in a man at any point in time in the year is varied. So very, very much so varied, such that whenever you think about what is it that the women are picking because they're sniffing their sweat. Now, we don't know really if testosterone is in sweat per se. We know that there are a lot of different things that sweat can tell you. Like sweat can tell you what a person eats, sweat can tell you how stressful a person is, or how stressed a person is. Sweat can tell you many, many things, but they say they tested the blood testosterone levels of the men afterwards. So the sweat, I don't think, told the women that. I think what women can pick up what people can pick up in sweat is all the things that I said that we know, like empirically, that's what sweat can tell you about a person, per se. But it's the case that with those things being the case, just evaluate the situation. Would it be the case that the the reason why the sweat may have correlated with the blood testosterone levels is because the blood testosterone levels of the peak men are peak because of other situations, meaning they could have better health, they could have a better job setting, they could be making more per year. You don't actually know the degree to actual physical attractiveness of these people. There's a lot of things you're not evaluating. You can't really measure. You can't really tell. Because, and the reason why I say this is because I'm willing to bet that if you were to grab, I don't know if I would bet this, but I'd say this, like you can grab somebody who is not, it's just that I think it could be the case that you could get someone who has lower blood testosterone levels on average than one man, but then you pick a particular day, and you will find that his is higher than this one man's. But that's not a good. It's a game stat. So it's, for example, you could probably find NBA games where somebody gets more points in a game than Michael Jordan, but just because you watch one game and you see somebody get more points than Michael Jordan, that does not mean that they're the better basketball player. And I make that analogy not to say a man with higher testosterone is better or something like that, but just to say that there are many things which influence its expression at any one point in time, such that those inferences seem unreliable. Also, it's the case that you're just looking at one section in time, and that's not really going to be a very good description of what's the median or the average for any particular individual, and you don't know if the women would pick the same way if they picked again at the same period in their ovulation, just like a few months later. There was nothing like that in terms of follow-up studies done. So let's talk about then what were the results when other scientists tried to re-replicate this study. It was never re-replicated. So that's the thing that nobody talks about. It was never re-replicated. In fact, in some instances, the results were didn't agree with the original results of the experiment. So the women didn't always pick the men with the highest blood testosterone levels. And so, I mean, so saying that is to say that the study is bunk. So if you can't reproduce something in science, and anytime somebody tries to do exactly what you did and they got a very different result, then chances are you did something wrong. And I can point out the errors in their reasoning, but I mean, to me, I would never have made those conclusions, because that's just really, really bad leaps in reasoning. That's what I'd say. Yeah. Anyways. So yeah, and so that's what I'd say. But that's what happened, and so when we look at the science of pheromones in general, and so that's where the idea of pheromones in human beings come from in the first place. This very poorly conducted sweaty T-shirt experiment, and so people, I guess, they just So we believe a lot of funny things. I don't know. I suppose because various cultures. So I suppose I can see the sense for this. Various cultures have used scents as aphrodisiacs to inspire the human libido, whether for men or women, and so I mean, a lot of people have incense and things like that going off in their bedroom when they're having sex and everything like that, because sex is a very sensual thing. So I suppose when you're looking at the phenomenon of sex specifically, it makes sense that scents have some kind of, I shouldn't have said pheromone, or began to say pheromones, but that scents would have some kind of play in the dynamic of our sexual nature to some extent. But the leap to, well, that's what we use to know who's who and what's what, that's just problematic to me. That was just way too far of a leap. And I was reaching for that other one, so it's like I'm good at divergent thinking, but I don't know if really that was what was going on in their reasoning. That's the only way I could justify it, and even then, when it comes down to rationally looking at it, that's not a good line of logic. So yeah, but that was that study, and so that's where the science of pheromones arise, and so the science of pheromones is based on the idea of the variance in histone compatibility complex in mice, and I'm not saying that that isn't necessarily true for people. It's just that nobody's really found that. And then when we look at the science of pheromones, it's a very dismal area of research. No, we don't know if human beings. There's nothing in terms of our neurology that would indicate that there's anything that deals with pheromones in terms of neuroreceptors. So things that usually deal with hormones and various other neurotransmitters and endorphins. There's nothing that seems to be in terms of what we can look at it in terms of our neurology that says that pheromones go here. Where you do have dopaminergic receptors in the brain, you have serotonergic receptors in the brain, you have the brain, it seems like it is set up so that it has anything that would actually affect it or elicit some kind of something from it. It seems like it has a place for it, but we've never found anything for pheromones. That's not to say pheromones don't exist. It's just that if it's the case that we do smell these things about people, then where is it registering in our mind? And even whenever it comes to the things that are more self-organizing in terms of our nature, I mean, it could be so deep down in terms of our physiology, like maybe the pheromones go to our gut or something like that. I mean, there could be many different explanations, but even in terms of the kind of self-organizing principles about the rest of the body. The liver does not do something without the brain not knowing, and it's not the case that those all of the communication and the neurotransmitters and hormones that the rest of the organs are responsible for mediating and eliciting at various points in time still check in with the brain. And everything that the body can dictate, there seems to be a place in the brain for it. So it just seems weird that if we had pheromones, there would be no way to tell that our brain could actually respond to pheromones if they actually existed. And then when you look at people's physiology in terms of our sweat and things like that, there's no pheromones in our sweat or anything like that. Like, everybody generally has a smell, but that has more to do with the bacteria on the surface of your skin and what you ate and a lot of different other things, but it's not pheromones. Maybe that's what people are evaluating about one another. Maybe those things have some correlation with fitness and things like that, but there's nothing in there that's new that scientists haven't known before the science of pheromones. So that's the way that I would put it. There's nothing new. And so there doesn't seem to be, we don't seem to be receptive to pheromones. We don't seem to produce them. So there doesn't seem to be any reason to believe that pheromones actually exist in human beings or would affect our psychology, which actually I didn't know before now, that there was a very big business of pheromone perfume and various things like that. So that one can't be humanly based because humans don't produce them. So I don't know what animals' pheromones you're wearing, but they're not human ones. And yeah, other than that, it probably doesn't work. So wearing pheromone perfume is not going to make a man any more or less attractive to you. The pheromones aren't going to help, but in terms of human beings, from just the general standpoint, we do know human beings are visual creatures, and because human beings are visual creatures, they tend to select for their mates visually. Go figure. So the things we know people like to pay attention to are sexual dimorphism, and we know people like to pay attention to people pay attention to other factors that are not based on just purely appearance, but it is the case people like voices and things like that. And so the pitch and the tonality of a person's partner influences how sexually attractive they are to that individual. But besides that, it's also the case that most everything else is pretty visual. So sexual dimorphism has everything to do with the facial structure of an individual and their body dimensions and just the overall physiology of the individual. It's not the only thing, because there is a lot of variation in dimorphism in terms of human beings, but most heterosexual people, even gay people, most people are dimorphized in some significant way or in some telling way. When they're not the norm. Hate to break it to you if you're not a very dimorphized person. In most instances, you're not going to mistake a man for a woman, and most without some serious operations. And in most instances, you're not going to mistake a woman for a man. Even if you don't think a woman is necessarily attractive, or even if you don't think a man is necessarily attractive, chances are, in terms of their face and skeletal structure, you will not mistake them for one another. And that's generally true. Past puberty, like prior to puberty, there's virtually no difference, but non-pubescent children aren't interested in sex, so it doesn't apply to them. So but I mean, so that's a thing. And BMI, we know that men evaluate women on their body mass index. It's not necessarily that women have to be skinny, but it is the case that men like fat in certain areas and not in other areas in terms of what they're evaluating in terms of attractiveness. So fat in lips and face, butt, thighs, and chest, or legs. Those are all places, or cheeks, rounder faces and things like that. Those are all nice things. But women with sharper features are very attractive too in terms of their face. But still the case that fat has to be in the right places. These are things that hold true for culture. There are cultural differences in terms of how much fat people prefer. Let's put it like that. It's the case that women tend to evaluate men on their appearance, but in terms of things that women like, They tend to like more symmetric faces in men. So women like symmetry in facial structure. They also like dimorphism, but they do not like dimorphism as much as men. So men like sexual dimorphism on average a little more than women care for or select for sexual dimorphism, as because I'm not really sure why. Women also evaluate men on more than one characteristic other than their appearance. Though, even though women won't say that that's, whenever you ask women to fill out surveys in terms of what's their number one, they put sexual attractiveness at number 10 or something like that in terms of actually, whenever you study women in other settings, whenever they can't talk to you, but you just observe them, it's probably more like 3 or 2 on their list in terms of how they actually act or operate. So that's the way that I put it. And so it's probably 2 or 3. What's there in the top spot is open for debate. So there's been different things that people say. People say status, some people say ability. Some people say there's no difference between status and ability. I don't think that's true. But it's the case that take your pick. And there is some merit to each of the arguments. So it's the case that usually people who have high status in some sort of uh, domain or achievement have a decent amount of ability if it's competitive. But it's also the case that that's not always true. So it's like to whatever, pick it for however it is. I mean, it's the case that women do use social criteria to judgment. Women also, and so they use, that's how I should summarize it. Women use more than men use biological factors just straight up, just visually. That's how they're oriented. It's not the case though that determines who men will marry. That's more or less who men find sexually attractive. So this is about sexual attractiveness. Marriage and things like that is a bit different than sexual attractiveness. So that's the way that's the distinction I would like for people to make. It doesn't mean that those two things don't have correlation, but who people find sexually attractive versus who they marry are not always very different, but they're different. They're different concerns. And so I'm not factoring that in. Men do use visual criteria no matter what, though, but whenever it comes to marriage and things like that, it's a different kind of dynamic because men then start evaluating social things a little more on average. So these are averages. These are not like on when it comes to an individual, that's that individual. So I put it like that. For any one of these things that I'm saying. And so that's what we know about human sexuality from a general standpoint, but you'll notice that that list is not extensive. So that should tell you that there's a lot we don't know. And so that's the real truth about human sexuality. We don't really know why people are sexually attracted to whatever it is that they're attracted to in terms of mate selection even. So, I mean, human beings are self-organizing nonlinear systems. They're very complicated. In terms of sexuality in general, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Because, I mean, some of the predictors so we know, for example, that human sexuality is like 25 to 35% genetic. So that's actually not a lot. So we don't know, it's not strictly environment either. So this is the issue. Like, we don't know what's mediating the goddamn thing. So it's not like, it's not a clear cut thing. A lot of times people like to say, biology or environment, but it doesn't work like that, just strictly. So it's like, it's a bit complicated. And so when it comes to sexuality, I mean, like, God, whatever. It's just as complicated as it is. So, what's a better predictor for who someone is going to be sexually interested in is their initial sexual experiences, whether they be positive or negative. That influences people more so than anything else for the rest of their life. And so, because human beings are behaviorally adaptive creatures, we're learning creatures. And so we do have biological tastes. So maybe our biology gets us more towards evaluating and choosing certain partners to, I suppose, entertain or evaluate, to reiterate myself or repeat myself. But that may be it, but that's not the linchpin determining factor. In fact, one of the things that I do not like about our conceptions of human sexuality is we do not give sociality enough credit and due, I don't think. Not sociality from the standpoint of social constructivist theory, but sociality, and as it's understood from a social biological anthropological standpoint. That, even though they're the social theorist and there's a sociologist, but social science, in terms of how it's studied from a more empirical scientific standpoint, has been studied very seriously by anthropologists a lot longer than there have been social scientists per se. Because I guess, like, when I mean sociality, it's from the standpoint of what's long social standing within human nature. Whenever you're looking at social political dynamics, those things are as I suppose, telling and as influential as the weather. Whatever weather was yesterday is going to influence what weather looks like tomorrow. So it's the case that what tomorrow looks like depends on today. But why today looks the way that it does, nobody really knows. So it's a confluence of many, many factors that were so random that you can't even actually place your finger on it. It's just one big statistical crapshoot. I mean, it's all probabilistically determined to a certain degree, such that the probabilities are what they are because of what happened before. You can't have anything happen, but at the same time, once a certain set of events go into motion, there's a number of things that could happen, and each thing that could happen will be influenced by what happened prior. But as the prior probabilities build up, the more things get seemingly certain until some fundamental element within that system changes, then the change in that system can be very drastic and violent. For example, taking the wolves out of Yellowstone. That, is not a good thing. Or eating, poisonous food. So, like, or getting food poisoning, your health is perfectly fine in one moment, and then suddenly after that, you're a very noxious thing because all of the, I suppose, empirical landscape that's not man-made is self-organizing, and so that's why it looks like it does, and that's what human sexuality is fundamentally. Um, which is to say that there are some initial conditions, like in terms of biology and but sociality. So I suppose I'd put it like, yeah. So anyways, so that's so no, because I was talking about anthropologists versus sociologists. Sociologists to me just look at the weather patterns. They don't look at the initial conditions enough. And so anthropologists are the ones that look at the initial conditions. So whenever I'm thinking of social dynamics, I'm thinking of social dynamics from the standpoint of the initial conditions of human societies and I guess the evolution of culture over time from an anthropological standpoint. And so whenever I think about it like that, I do not know why we do not consider the role of sociality in mediating human sexuality. In fact, I think that human sexuality is mostly socially mediated. For biological reasons, because we're a social animal. And in fact, because we're a hierarchical social animal, I think that sexuality is probably mostly sexually mediated, and socially mediated. And what modernity has done has made it more biologically mediated, which is, good or bad to say. It's not like those things are completely unrelated to one another. So it's just the case that so here's a reason. So here's another side discussion to have in this whole deal. Here's another reason why modernity is hard, because it's the case that your biology is left to organize itself in a way in which it never really has had to for any of human history. So even in terms of our initial conception, this is why I like evolution rather than religion, because it makes things make sense. But it's like, even in terms of our weight gain, I mean, it's or the obesity in America. Look, man, it's a rather modern predicament. There are many things that are modern predicaments because the human animal has never been under these conditions whatsoever. You know, whether or not you're a failure is not completely your fault to a certain extent, or the things that you struggle with is not completely your fault whatsoever, because you're a certain kind of animal who is under an ever-changing system of conditions. And many of the, I guess, environmental changes that we have established in terms of policies and everything like that affects the actual expression of our genes. I mean, in a very direct way. So, I mean to say that it's the case that where everybody tends to think that the bureaucratic reach of things is becoming much more prominent, and that may be true, but it's also the case that we've let our biology out of the bag much more in modernity than we have in the past, and it's the case that, well, so at one point in time we were being completely mediated and determined by it. We weren't aware of it. Now we still aren't aware of it. It's just the case that we have done so many things that outside of the pressures of nature and the, I guess, normative dynamics that have been on us for most of our existence are no longer able to reach us in the direct ways they once were. So life is a lot more easier for many people within Western landscapes, and so there's a caveat there. And even for people around the world, it's the case that modernity has made life uh, much more convenient. That's the way that I would say. Not necessarily better, but convenient. Because there are problems even with the convenience. Because we're an animal that doesn't actually. So it just requires you to organize yourself on your own, to organize your biology in a certain way. That was once basically done for it. Nothing does it now. Unless you have parents and things like that. But even then, you know, it's not the case that. So there's a lot of myths in terms of platonic families. All right, anyways, I'm gonna stick with this human sexuality thing. Sorry. Anyways, so modernity has also introduced some different factors to, I guess, our the social dynamic within human sexual selection. It's a lot less direct. It's much more mediated through media and culture and various things like that, but not so much through religious institutions, tribes, or governments, and various other forces like that. And so I would say that's going to have its own consequences, and I think it already is. I mean, I'm not going to labor too much on this because I think my camera is going to cut me off very soon, but that's what I can say so far, and so I'll make this a part 1 video because I do have some other ideas. So I'll make a part 2, but that's my video, and thank you for watching.